My presentation, I chose the Take It Out of the Class article by Joy Bowers Campbell, and this is my review of it. First question I want to ask you before we proceed is which group of students in the following slides would you rather see in your classroom? So just think to yourself, would I rather see the students on the left in my classroom or would I rather see the students on the right? Again, would you rather engage with the student on the left or with the student on the right? Last one. Would you rather have the students on the left or the students on the right represent the students in your classroom? I know this is a really tough question with some really hard choices, so go ahead and really consider what both students and what both groups of students represent. So obviously, we all want the students that were looking engaged and happy and had their hands raised. And we are always constantly searching for activities that'll help us do that. This article, the Take It Out of the Class article, um, gives us an idea on how to incorporate technology with literature circles to engage our students and hopefully make them all look like the more engaged students in the previous pictures than the ones that were bored or sleeping or just not really paying attention. One of the quotes that stood out to me as I started reading this article was threaded discussions foster energetic interactions between students and teachers and promote active and collaborative learning. Um, I love an active classroom. I love when my students are talking and engaged and conversing with each other. And so I love the idea of literature circles. But a lot of my classes are online this year, and that's why I chose this article because I want to do literature circles, but I feel like I just needed a little bit of encouragement that it could still work with my online students. Literature circles have some very obvious pros and some very obvious cons. So I listed a few that the article went over, and one of the pros is that cooperative learning is a student led experience for students around a common text. Um, Another one is that students who talk about what they read are more likely to engage in reading. And then finally, students engaged in literature circles demonstrated increased comprehension, higher level thinking, and an ability to engage more deeply with text. All of these are things that we want as teachers. I don't think any of us are going to look and be like, no, I'd actually really rather my students be quiet and disengaged from what I'm teaching. No, we want them to be engaged. We want them to be talking and learning. And students who talk about what they read are more likely to engage in their reading, then that's what we need to do. But how do I do this whenever I don't actually have my students in class and they're not necessarily going to talk to each other through Zoom? What do I do? And then there are also some cons with literature circles that we need to talk about. And one of them is really the second one on this cons list. As soon as teachers left, group cohesion dissolved. That is the biggest issue that I've seen where students can talk a great talk, but as soon as I walk away, it stops. And that's completely counterproductive. That is not what we want to happen. And so I read this article hoping that it would give me some guidance about what to do and how to prevent that, especially in an online setting. This article addresses the successes and issues of literature circles, but it also proposes technology as a way to eliminate some of those struggles. Nothing is ever going to be perfect because we're working with students who are young human beings who are all imperfect. So, no process is ever going to be 100% fault free. But the technology proposed in this article could be a way to eliminate some of the issues that literature circles face. The key question that was asked in this article is how does integrating technology with literature circles affect group dynamics and students' reading responses? So I really liked this question because it kind of was the big question that I was asking myself. And so it told me exactly what Joy Bowers Campbell was about to research and present to me. So this is the how she studied this. So obviously, as reading educators to be or reading educators currently, we understand what literature circles are. I didn't really need that explained to me, and I didn't really need to know how to run a literature circle. Um, but she did study this qualitatively, and so she studied 3 groups of graduate students in a month-long course using a book club groups. And she was actually lucky enough to use a hybrid option where they met with students for the first week, didn't see them for the next 2 weeks, and then met with them again the last week. And I think this kind of impacted her studies a little bit later on because her students had met each other face to face. So they'd had a week to kind of bond before going in. And so I'm not sure how this would apply to a class setting that has never actually physically met. Um, but that was a little bit interesting that she chose a hybrid model. And then she examined completed discussion posts, collected the bulk of the data from those discussion posts, and then created codes based on the group's discussions, not from a previously created framework. I thought that was really interesting because a lot of times beforehand, I will grade students on what I want to see instead of just grading them on what they actually produce naturally. I'm not sure that this would work in a lower level class, but I think that for an upper level, maybe AP or college level class, or even my 11th grade honors students, I could have this expectation for them. But I'm not entirely sure that it would be effective with a lower level class or with even like a remedial or moderate high school class. Here's what Bowers Campbell found. She found that the worry that teachers have that they say we're moving online will eliminate the camaraderie of a literature classroom were fairly unfounded because students were still responding to each other, and were still trying to connect, which is my second point there. There were students' efforts were obvious to connect with each other personally. Um, it also mentioned that she analyzed their language and they started using we, us, etc., like inclusive pronouns rather than exclusive pronouns where they just talked about themselves. And even in disagreements over the books, members were responsive to opinions opposite of theirs. And I think that's because they would have time to digest it and recognize that just because someone had a different opinion didn't mean that it was an attack on them. And so they could process this information without having to immediately respond, and they could kind of mull it over before they answered. And then overall, students were very engaged with each book despite the online format. So there was no level of like super disengaging. Virtual literature circles facilitate socially constructed learning opportunities. Just another really great quote that I think embodies Joy Bowers Campbell's foundings and why she cared so much about researching these virtual literature circles and why they can be vital to a literature classroom. I looked for professional reviews or like critiques of this article, and I personally did not find any on the USF Library website. That doesn't mean that there wasn't an error in my research, and there could be, but I didn't find any. However, as a literature professional myself, I do have my own opinions on what I think was very good about this study and what I think maybe she's missing the point on a little bit, and I will get to that in the next slide. So, first and foremost, I was very encouraged by this research, and it did make me want to try literature circles with my online students, my honors online students, after I've had them for a little while and I can establish what good reading practice is. Um, I'm still going to incorporate literature circles solely in person because a lot of my students don't have access to technology at home, and so I can't just do virtual circles, but I can still use them in person, and I will still use them in person. Um, I am a little bit skeptical about whether or not they will work with my honors online students because they're not graduate students. they've also never met. I addressed the whole like they've never met, it's not a hybrid situation in a previous slide, but my biggest thing is that she used graduate students. As graduate students myself or ourselves, we know that we are very dedicated to our studies. We've chosen to get a higher level of degree than most people have. I also know that as a grad student, I'm far more dedicated to my studies than I was as a high school student. And I took AP literature and I was a very strong reader. And I still didn't read all the books and I still didn't want it to engage. And I got very good at faking it. And so that is my biggest concern is that she studied grad students, not K-12 students. So I'm not entirely sure that you can apply the same success story to a high school student who's probably just going to spark note the book. Overall, I found her research really fascinating and very encouraging, and so I am still going to try to incorporate literature circles, and I do still want to try them online, even though I was initially opposed to it. So it was a very encouraging article to read. It did have some interesting points and some good ideas. So I'm going to take away from it what I did and try it. I am still skeptical of whether or not it'll work with my students, being that they're high school age and not grad student, but I love student choice. I love literature circles, and so I'm still going to try it. Thank you for listening.